So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Give me the keys, Sloane snapped, her voice cutting through the hushed elegance of the Sterling gallery. You don't look like you belong in a car like this anyway, and Julian's mother is already staring. Eleanor Vance felt the cold weight of the vintage Merced's keys in her palm, the metal biting into her skin. She looked at her daughter, who stood resplendent in a cream-colored silk suit that cost more than Eleanor's annual pension as an archivist. Sloane didn't see a mother. She saw a branding liability. To Sloane, the woman who had raised her was merely a smudge of dust on a polished glass life. "It's my car, Sloane," Eleanor said quietly. Her voice was a low, steady contrast to the sharp, frantic energy radiating from her daughter. Sloane let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the attention of three women in cocktail dresses nearby. They paused, champagne flutes midair, their eyes drifting toward the confrontation. "It's a classic, Mother. It's an asset. You're just letting it rot in that drafty garage along with those moldy boxes of yours. Julian needs to arrive at the gala in something that commands respect, not his father's sensible sedan." Julian Sterling stepped forward then, smoothing his hand over his perfectly tailored blazer. He didn't look Eleanor in the eye. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks with the practiced ease of a man who had never known a day of genuine labor. "It's just for the night, Eleanor. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important for the Sterling image. Appearance is everything in this circle." Beyond them, standing near a towering arrangement of white lilies that smelled cloyingly of funerals and old money, was Blythe Sterling. The matriarch watched the scene with a thin, icy smile. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply observed Eleanor's modest, wool coat and sensible shoes as if she were examining a particularly stubborn stain on the gallery's Carrara marble floors. The humiliation was calculated. Sloane had chosen this moment, this public stage, knowing Eleanor hated scenes. "The Sterlings are the pinnacle of this city's social fabric," Sloane whispered, leaning in so close that the scent of her expensive, metallic perfume filled Eleanor's senses. "I am one signature away from being part of that. I won't let your stubbornness or your aesthetic ruin this for me. Hand them over. Now." Eleanor looked past her daughter at the walls of the gallery. She knew every piece hanging there. In fact, she had quietly facilitated the anonymous donation of the centerpiece landscape 3 years ago through the Vance Foundation. Sloane didn't know the foundation existed. She didn't know that the archivist she mocked for playing with paper held the legal strings to the very building they were standing in. For decades, Eleanor had lived by a code of silence. She believed that true power didn't need to scream. But as she watched Sloane's lip curl in a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt, something in Eleanor's chest shifted. The sleeping lion didn't roar. It simply opened its eyes. "You're right, Sloane," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a level that forced her daughter to lean in. "Appearance is everything." She dropped the keys into Sloane's manicured hand. The clatter of metal against skin seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. Sloane smirked, a flash of triumph lighting up her eyes as she tucked the keys into her clutch. "Good," Sloane said, turning her back on her mother without another word. "Julian, let's go. We have a seating chart to finalize with Blythe." Eleanor watched them walk away. She watched Julian place a possessive hand on Sloane's waist, and she watched Blythe Sterling offer a nod of approval that was more like a transaction being closed. They moved with the unearned confidence of predators who thought they had found a sheep. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed, illuminating the lines of a face that had seen too much history to be intimidated by a real estate agent and a trust fund heir. She scrolled past notifications of estate taxes and dividend yields until she found the name she needed. She stepped out of the gallery and onto the sidewalk. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. She didn't call a cab. She didn't need to. "Marcus," she said when the call was answered on the first ring. "Eleanor, it's late. Is everything all right?" Marcus Thorne's voice was like gravel over silk, the voice of a man who broke contracts for breakfast. "I need you to pull the Sterling file," Eleanor said, watching through the gallery window as Sloane laughed at something Blythe said. Specifically the bridge loan for their development in the Heights, the one funded by the Vance Foundation's private equity arm. There was a brief pause on the other end. The Sterlings are over-leveraged on that project, Eleanor. If we pull the support, the whole thing collapses. It would be catastrophic for them. Eleanor watched her daughter toss her head back, the light catching the diamond earrings Eleanor had given her for her 21st birthday. Earrings Sloane had claimed were nice for a knockoff. I know, Eleanor said, her voice as cold as the marble she had just walked off. I want a full audit of the Sterling assets, and Marcus, check the commission records for Sloane's firm. I have a feeling my daughter has been taking liberties with her escrow accounts to keep up with her new friends. Are we starting the archival process, then? Marcus asked, his tone shifting to one of professional lethalness. No, Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on the silhouette of her daughter. We're starting the liquidation. I want to see exactly what's left when the dust settles. She hung up and began walking toward the subway. She had spent a lifetime preserving the past. Now she was going to enjoy watching the future she had built for Sloane burn to the ground. As she descended the stairs into the station, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a document, a forged signature on a deed. Detective Miller had been busy. Eleanor deleted the message and smiled. The game hadn't just begun, it was already over. Sloane just didn't know it yet. The next morning, the sun glared off the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Sterling Vance group with a clinical, unforgiving light. Eleanor Vance stood in the minimalist lobby, her sensible loafers silent on the polished white marble. The air here smelled of roasted Arabica and expensive bleach, a scent that usually signaled success, but today it felt like the sterile breath of a hospital wing. She watched her daughter through the glass walls of a private conference room. Sloane Vance was in her element, draped in a cream-colored silk suit that likely cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. She was laughing, her head tilted back as she gestured toward a digital display showing a sprawling coastal estate. Beside her sat Blythe Sterling, the matriarch of the Sterling family, who watched the screen with the predatory focus of a hawk. When Sloane finally noticed her mother standing by the reception desk, the smile didn't just fade, it curdled. She whispered something to Blythe, smoothed her jacket, and stepped out into the lobby. The sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of her designer heels echoed against the stone walls, a sound intended to intimidate. "Eleanor," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a hushed, urgent hiss. She didn't offer a hug or even a polite smile. "What are you doing here? I told you I'd send a car for your things on Friday." "This is a high-stakes morning. I'm closing the Sterling merger." "I brought the files you asked for, Sloane," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and deceptively soft. She held out a modest manila folder. "The ones regarding the archival holdings." Sloane snatched the folder, glancing nervously back at the conference room where Blythe was watching. "Right, the consultant. Just stay over there by the espresso bar. Don't wander off and start talking to the staff about the old days. I have Julian and his mother in there, and they don't need to be reminded of the dust." The dismissal was a sharp sting, a deliberate attempt to erase Eleanor's status in front of the people who were currently benefiting from her life's work. Eleanor watched as her daughter walked back into the room and leaned over Julian Sterling, who had just entered. He squeezed Sloane's hand, his eyes fixed on the document Sloane was now spreading across the table. Eleanor moved toward the espresso bar, but her eyes remained on the conference table. From this distance, she could see the corner of the document Sloane was highlighting. It was the deed Detective Miller had messaged her about, the one with the forged signature. Sloane was using a stolen piece of Eleanor's past to secure her future with the Sterlings. A few minutes later, Sloane emerged again, this time trailed by Julian. He looked polished and utterly vacant, the kind of man who had never had to work for a single cent he spent. "Eleanor, good to see you," Julian said, though he didn't move to shake her hand. He checked his gold watch instead. "Sloane says you're helping us clear up some of the final title issues on the Vance properties. We really appreciate the cooperation. It makes the transition into the Sterling Trust much smoother. Transition, Eleanor repeated, the word tasting like ash. Is that what we're calling it? Sloane stepped between them, her eyes flashing a warning. Julian, why don't you go check on the catering for the gala? I just need Mom to sign one last internal routing slip. Once Julian was out of earshot, Sloane pushed a single sheet of paper toward Eleanor on the marble counter. Sign this. It's just a waiver for the insurance on the archival transport. It saves us about $20,000 in premiums. Eleanor looked down. It wasn't an insurance waiver. Hidden under the jargon of the third paragraph was a clause that would grant Sloane power of attorney over the Vance Foundation's remaining liquid assets. It was a blatant trap, wrapped in the guise of a daughter's routine business. You seem in a hurry, Sloane, Eleanor said, her fingers grazing the cool, heavy paper. The engagement gala is in 3 days, Sloane snapped, her patience finally snapping. The entire city will be at the Sterling estate. I don't have time for your sentimental hesitation. Just sign it so we can move on with our lives. You wanted me to be successful, didn't you? This is what it looks like. Eleanor picked up the designer pen Sloane offered. She felt the weight of it, the cold metal against her skin. She thought of the liquidation orders Marcus Thorne was currently preparing. She thought of the forged deed sitting 10 feet away. 3 days, Eleanor murmured. She scribbled a signature, not her own, but the stylized, illegible scrawl she had used on her library card for 40 years. It wasn't a legal signature, but Sloane was too arrogant to check. There, Eleanor said, handing the pen back. I hope the gala is everything you've dreamed of. Sloane snatched the paper, a look of triumph finally breaking through her mask of irritation. It will be. Try to find something that doesn't smell like mothballs to wear, Eleanor. I've put you at the back table with the distant cousins, but people will still see you. As Sloane turned her back to return to her empire of glass and lies, Eleanor pulled her phone from her pocket. She dialed a number she knew by heart. Marcus, she said, her voice dropping into a tone of professional lethalness as she walked toward the exit. The trap is set. She just took the bait. Tell Miller to have the originals ready for the gala. I want the Sterling family to see exactly who they're bringing into their fold. She stepped out into the humid city air, the heavy glass doors sealing shut behind her with a satisfying, airtight thud. The countdown had begun. 3 days until the Sterling name and Sloane's carefully constructed world turned to dust. 2 days later, the atmosphere in Marcus Thorne's private office was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive espresso. Eleanor Vance sat in a high-backed leather chair, her posture as rigid as the mahogany desk between them. Outside, the city hummed with the frantic energy of a Tuesday morning, but inside this room, time seemed to move with the deliberate, heavy pace of a ticking clock. Marcus leaned forward, sliding a thick, cream-colored folder across the polished surface. Beside him, Detective Miller stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the documents. Everything is here, Marcus said, his voice a low, rhythmic baritone. The architect's ledger. It's the original paper trail for the Sterling Foundation. Most people think Julian's grandfather built that empire from the ground up, but these ledgers tell a different story. It was your family's capital, Eleanor. Your father's silent partnership was the only thing keeping the Sterling name from bankruptcy 3 decades ago. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, slightly textured surface of the folder. She felt a strange, grounding weight in her chest. For years, she had lived in the shadow of the Sterling prestige, watching Sloane claw her way into their inner circle as if she were ascending a throne. Sloane didn't realize she was trying to occupy a house her own mother held the mortgage on. And the recent transactions, she asked, her voice steady. Detective Miller stepped closer, tapping a printed spreadsheet. Your daughter was thorough, I'll give her that. She used her position as Julian's fiancée to gain access to the Sterling Trust accounts. She's been siphoning funds into a shell company for 6 months, likely planning to rescue the family business with their own stolen money once she has the Sterling name. She thinks she's being clever, but she's left a trail of digital breadcrumbs a mile wide. She's not just arrogant, Eleanor murmured. She's desperate for a legacy she didn't earn. The sharp, electronic chime of her phone interrupted the silence. Eleanor glanced at the screen. It was a video call from Sloane. She signaled for silence and answered, holding the device so only her face was visible. Sloane appeared on the screen, her hair perfectly coiffed, standing in what looked like a high-end bridal boutique. Behind her, Blythe Sterling was visible, draped in silk and inspecting a rack of evening gowns with a look of practiced boredom. "Mother," Sloane snapped, her voice tinny but dripping with its usual condescension. "I'm sending a courier to your little apartment. Don't bother opening whatever moth-eaten thing you were planning to wear to the gala. I've bought you a dress. It's beige. It'll help you blend into the curtains at the back of the room so you don't embarrass Julian's mother." In the background, Blythe turned, her eyes narrowing as she caught a glimpse of the screen. "Is that her, Sloane? Do tell her the seating chart is finalized. We've put the extended family in the annex. The lighting is a bit dim, but I'm sure she'll find it quite cozy." Sloane smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph dancing in her eyes. "Did you hear that? Even the Sterlings think you're a liability. Honestly, Eleanor, you should be thanking me. I'm giving you a front-row seat to the life you were too weak to build for yourself. Just stay out of the way and try not to speak to the press. They're looking for success stories, not relics." Eleanor felt the familiar sting of Sloane's words, but this time it was tempered by the cold reality of the ledger beneath her hand. She watched her daughter, this woman she had raised, who now looked at her with the same disgust one might afford a smudge on a window. "I'll be there, Sloane," Eleanor said, her voice a calm, chilling contrast to her daughter's frantic energy. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I hope the Sterlings are prepared for everything that's coming." Sloane rolled her eyes. "Always so dramatic, just wear the beige, Mother. It's the only thing you're worth." The call ended with a sharp click. The room fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Eleanor looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. "She has no idea," Miller said, shaking his head. "She's standing on a trapdoor and she's practicing her victory dance." Marcus pulled a silver pen from his pocket and handed it to Eleanor. "The final step, Eleanor. This is the formal revocation of the Sterling Trust's management rights. Since they've breached the original 1994 agreement by allowing unauthorized access, namely Sloane's embezzlement, you have the legal right to freeze every asset they own. By the time the first toast is poured at that gala, the Sterling family will be penniless, and Sloane will be the face of their ruin." Eleanor took the pen. It felt heavy, cold, and final. She signed her name with a flourish she hadn't used in years. The ink was dark and wet, a permanent mark against the lies that had defined her daughter's life. 2 days, Eleanor said, looking at the clock on Marcus's wall. 48 hours until the Sterling name becomes a footnote. "The originals will be delivered to the gala in a secure briefcase," Marcus confirmed, his eyes gleaming with a shark-like intensity. "Miller and I will be in the wings. All you have to do is walk through the door." Eleanor stood up, smoothing the front of her modest wool coat. She thought of the beige dress Sloane was sending, a shroud for a woman Sloane thought was dead. She smiled, a small, lethal curve of the lips. "Tell the courier to leave the dress at the door," Eleanor said as she walked toward the exit. "I have something much more fitting in mind for the occasion." She stepped out of the office and into the hallway, the heavy sound of her own footsteps echoing against the marble. The countdown was no longer a threat. It was a promise. Sloane wanted a show, and Eleanor was going to give her a performance that would bring the entire house down. The day before the Sterling Gala arrived with a deceptive stillness that settled over Eleanor Vance's small apartment like a shroud. She stood by the window, watching the morning fog roll off the river, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold edge of a silver thumb drive. It was a small thing, no larger than a lipstick tube, yet it contained the weight of 100 broken promises and 5 years of Sloane's systematic theft. The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that broke the silence. On the doorstep sat a courier holding a garment bag. There was no note, only a digital signature required for a delivery from Vance Real Estate. Eleanor unzipped the bag, and the smell of cheap, industrial lavender hit her, a scent Sloane associated with the elderly. Inside was the beige dress, a limp polyester monstrosity that looked more like a uniform for a servant than a gown for a guest of honor. "A shroud," Eleanor whispered, her voice like dry leaves. She didn't try it on. She didn't need to. She knew exactly how Sloane wanted her to look, invisible, faded, and grateful. 2 hours later, Eleanor arrived at the Sterling corporate offices for the final walkthrough. The lobby was a temple of glass and arrogance, smelling of expensive espresso and the ozone of high-end air purifiers. She found Sloane Vance standing in the center of a makeshift stage, barking orders at a team of frantic event planners. Julian Sterling stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her waist, though his eyes were glued to his phone, likely tracking the plummeting margins of his family's textile firm. "You're late," Sloane snapped, not bothering to look up from her tablet. She was dressed in a sharp, blood-red power suit that cost more than Eleanor's annual pension. "Julian, tell the caterers the vintage needs to be moved up. I won't have the Sterling name associated with mid-shelf Prosecco." Julian nodded absently, his gold watch clinking against his cufflink, a sound of inherited wealth that Eleanor knew was currently backed by nothing but air. "Of course, darling. Eleanor, glad you could make it. We need to go over your seating." He led her toward a floor plan displayed on a massive digital screen. Sloane followed, her stilettos clicking against the marble like a countdown. She pointed a manicured nail at a small table tucked behind a decorative pillar, far from the podium and the cameras. "You'll sit here," Sloane said, her tone dripping with a faux kindness that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "It's closer to the exits in case you get tired. We wouldn't want you overwhelmed by the lights and the noise. It's a big night for the Sterlings, and frankly, you're only here as a courtesy to the brand." Eleanor looked at the screen, then at her daughter. She saw the predatory glint in Sloane's eyes, the absolute certainty that she had already won. "It certainly is a big night," Eleanor said, her voice remarkably steady. "Are you sure you're prepared for the level of attention this gala will bring, Sloane? Once the lights go up, there's no hiding the details." Sloane let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Details are my specialty, Mother. That's why I'm the one on the stage and you're the one in the beige dress. Just stay in your seat, keep your mouth shut, and try not to look so impoverished. It's bad for the aesthetic." Julian shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to Eleanor. For a second, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. He had seen Eleanor in the old days, before the retirement, and the cold fire in her eyes didn't match the humble role Sloane had scripted for her. "Sloane, maybe we should move her a bit closer to the front. Blythe might ask why." "Blythe Sterling knows exactly who belongs where," Sloane interrupted, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "Mother understands her place, don't you?" Eleanor felt the thumb drive in her pocket, a secret power that hummed against her thigh. She leaned in slightly, the scent of Sloane's trendy, overpriced perfume filling the gap between them. "I understand exactly where I belong," Eleanor whispered. "And I understand where you belong, too. Tomorrow night, the truth will be the only aesthetic that matters." Sloane rolled her eyes, turning back to the stage. "Whatever. Just don't forget to bring your ID for security." "Marcus Thorne said he'd be handling the VIP list personally, and I don't want any hiccups." Eleanor turned toward the exit, her modest coat swishing around her ankles. She didn't look back. She had dropped the warning, and as expected, Sloane's ego had acted as a shield against the truth. As she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "The briefcase is locked. Miller is positioned. The countdown is at 12 hours. Eleanor looked up at the towering Sterling building, the glass reflecting the gray sky. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the architect of a collapse that was already in motion. Tomorrow, the beige dress would stay in the trash, and the Sterling name would finally face the audit it deserved. She began to walk, her pace rhythmic and sure, the silent rehearsal finally over. The evening arrived with a chill that the Sterling estate's climate control couldn't quite mask. Eleanor Vance stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers grazing the smooth, cool fabric of the charcoal silk wrap she had chosen for the night. It was a far cry from the beige, liability. dress her daughter had tried to force upon her. The air in the room was thick with the cloying scent of thousands of imported white lilies, a fragrance so heavy it felt like a physical weight against her lungs. Across the polished marble floor, Sloane Vance was the undisputed son of the social solar system. She wore a gown that shimmered with enough hand-sewn crystals to fund a small library, her laughter ringing out like cut glass whenever a photographer drifted near. She was the brand, personified, leaning into Julian Sterling as if they were already royalty. Eleanor watched her daughter's performance with the detached precision of an archivist examining a forged document. She felt the weight of the small, encrypted flash drive tucked into the hidden velvet lining of her clutch. It was a silent power, a heavy secret that made the surrounding opulence look like a house of cards. "You're late," a voice hissed near her ear. Eleanor didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly to see Sloane standing there, her face a mask of practiced perfection that didn't quite reach her narrowed eyes. Sloane didn't offer a greeting. She didn't even look at her mother's face, her gaze instead raking over Eleanor's modest but elegant attire with visible disdain. "I arrived exactly when I intended to," Eleanor said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against the frantic energy of the room. Sloane let out a sharp, jagged breath. "I told you to stay in the foyer until the press was done. You look fine, I suppose, but you're ruining the aesthetic of the family lineup. Julian's mother is looking for us, and I'd prefer if you didn't speak unless someone asks you about your retirement. Keep it brief. Keep it boring." "I think tonight will be anything but boring, Sloane," Eleanor replied. She reached out, adjusting a stray loose thread on her daughter's sleeve. "You should be careful. When you build a life out of glass, the light can be very unforgiving." Sloane pulled her arm away as if she'd been burned, a sneer curling her lip. "Save the cryptic metaphors for your book club. You're here as a guest of the Sterling family, not a philosopher. Try not to embarrass me by acting like you belong in a room like this." The insult was a sharp, familiar sting, a rage spike that Eleanor welcomed. It fueled the fire she had been carefully tending for weeks. She watched as Sloane turned her back without another word, gliding toward Blythe Sterling, who stood near the grand staircase like a general reviewing her troops. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the back of the room. Near the heavy oak doors leading to the private study, she spotted Marcus Thorne. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's annual salary, looking every bit the shark he was. Beside him stood a man in a plain, dark suit, Detective Miller. They didn't wave. They didn't acknowledge her. Marcus simply tapped the face of his watch once. The countdown was at 0. Julian Sterling approached the center of the room, tapping a silver spoon against a crystal flute. The sound was high and piercing, cutting through the low hum of 100 conversations. The room fell into a curated silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never known a day of struggle. "Tonight is about more than just a union of two people. It's about the union of two legacies. The Sterling name has always stood for excellence, and in Sloane, I have found a partner who understands the value of that prestige." Eleanor moved through the crowd, her footsteps silent on the marble. She positioned herself near the front, just to the left of the podium where Blythe Sterling stood, her diamonds catching the light with every breath. "Before we begin the formal toast," Blythe said, stepping forward to take the microphone, "I want to acknowledge the foundation of this merger. The Vance-Sterling partnership is built on transparency, trust, and the immense assets that Sloane brings to our portfolio. It is a new era for our firm." Sloane beamed, her chest rising with pride as the room erupted in polite, rhythmic applause. She looked over at Eleanor, a triumphant, mocking smirk playing on her lips. It was the look of a predator who thought the prey was cornered. Eleanor didn't look away. She reached into her clutch and felt the cool metal of the drive. She caught Marcus's eye. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. "Actually," Eleanor said. The word wasn't loud, but it was delivered with such absolute clarity that it seemed to ripple through the ballroom. The applause faltered. Blythe Sterling paused, her brow furrowing in confusion as she looked toward the woman she had dismissed as a quiet, penniless retiree. "Mother, sit down," Sloane whispered, her voice a serrated blade. "What are you doing?" Eleanor stepped into the circle of light, the modest charcoal silk of her dress a stark contrast to the glittering excess around her. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the architect of a collapse. "I think there's a small matter of the Vance assets that hasn't been fully explained," Eleanor said, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "And since this is a night for transparency, I'd hate for the Sterlings to enter into a contract based on incomplete information." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a room holding its breath, the air suddenly cold and sharp. Sloane's face began to shift, the practiced perfection cracking to reveal a flicker of genuine, raw panic. Julian's glass paused halfway to his lips. Eleanor turned to the large projection screen behind the podium, the one currently displaying a montage of Sloane's real estate successes. "Marcus," Eleanor said softly. The screen flickered once, the images of luxury penthouses vanishing. In their place, a single, high-resolution document appeared. It was a bank audit, dated 48 hours ago, with the Vance Foundation seal at the top. The room went from silent to breathless. Eleanor watched the color drain from Sloane's face, the crystals on her dress no longer shimmering, but looking like shards of ice against a dying flame. "Let's talk about who actually owns the Sterling portfolio," Eleanor said, her voice like a gavel striking stone. The first gasp from the crowd was small, but it was the start of a landslide. Eleanor stood perfectly still, her heart beating with a rhythmic, vengeful calm. The face slap hadn't even landed yet, but the hand was already in the air. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the ballroom. Eleanor Vance stood perfectly still at the podium, her silhouette cast large against the bank audit that now dominated the room. The air, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne, seemed to freeze as the guests processed the numbers on the screen. The Vance Foundation didn't just fund the Sterling portfolio. It owned the debt, the equity, and the very ground beneath the Sterling family's feet. Sloane Vance let out a sharp, brittle laugh that died in her throat. She stepped forward, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble. "This is a mistake," she chirped, though her voice lacked its usual predatory edge. "A technical glitch. Mother, stop this embarrassing little stunt right now." She turned to the crowd, a forced, manic smile plastered on her face. "You all know how she gets. She's confused. The age, the isolation. It's tragic, really." Marcus Thorne didn't give her a chance to breathe. He stepped into the light of the projector, a thick, leather-bound folder in his hands. "There is no confusion, Sloane," he said, his voice cutting through her panic like a scalpel. He didn't look at her. He looked at the board members and the socialites who were already beginning to lean away from her. "As the primary legal counsel for the Vance Foundation, I am here to certify that every document on that screen is an authentic, audited record of ownership. Eleanor Vance is the sole proprietor of the Sterling holdings." Sloane's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, her mouth a jagged O of silent protest. The vibrant, polished bronze of her spray tan turned a sickly, curdled gray under the harsh LED glow of the projector. Her eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, glazed over with a frantic, uncomprehending terror as she watched her carefully constructed world dissolve into rows of black and white figures. A fine sheen of sweat broke across her forehead, ruining the precision of her contouring, while her breath came in sharp, hitching gasps that rattled against the silence of the ballroom. Her posture, once stiff with the arrogance of a queen, slumped until she looked small, fragile, and utterly exposed in her shimmering, useless crystals. The glass of champagne in her hand trembled so violently that the liquid slopped over the rim, staining her white silk gloves a mocking, celebratory gold. Beside her, Julian Sterling looked as though he had been struck. He stared at the screen, then at his mother. Blythe Sterling, the woman who had spent the evening treating Eleanor like a stain on the carpet, slowly withdrew her hand from Sloane's arm. The movement was deliberate and cold. Blythe took a step back, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Sloane not as a daughter-in-law, but as a liability. "Julian," Blythe whispered, the sound carrying in the deathly quiet room. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me we aren't beholden to her." "I didn't know," Julian stammered, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red. "Sloane said. She said the Vance Foundation was a subsidiary she managed." Detective Miller moved from the shadows near the entrance, his presence a silent, looming threat. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were fixed on Sloane, his notebook open. The social validation Sloane had craved her entire life was evaporating in real time. The whispers began, a low, rising tide of judgment. "She lied to the Sterlings." "How pathetic." Eleanor watched her daughters collapse with a calm that felt like a heavy cloak. She didn't feel the need to shout. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was doing the work for her. She reached out and adjusted the microphone, the slight screech of feedback making Sloane flinch as if she'd been slapped. "You told me earlier that I didn't belong in this room, Sloane," Eleanor said, her voice steady and resonant. "You told me I was a branding liability that needed to be managed and tucked away in a quiet corner." Sloane tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. She looked around the room, searching for an ally, but every face she met was a wall of cold indifference. Even Julian wouldn't meet her gaze. Eleanor stepped down from the podium, her modest dress moving softly as she walked toward the exit. She paused beside her daughter, leaning in just enough so that only Sloane could hear the finality in her tone. "You spent your life trying to hide me, but you were only ever living in my shadow. I don't just own the portfolio, Sloane. I own the house you live in, the car you drive, and the very reputation you just destroyed." Eleanor straightened her shoulders and looked at the stunned crowd one last time. "The Vance Foundation will be reviewing all Sterling contracts by morning. Good night." She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the ballroom, the sound of her own steady footsteps echoing against the sudden, explosive roar of the crowd behind her. As the heavy doors swung shut, the last thing she saw was Sloane falling to her knees, the shimmering crystals of her dress finally losing their light. The heavy doors had barely clicked shut when the first wave of panic hit the room. Sloane Vance didn't stay on her knees for long. The survival instinct that had fueled her climb to the top of the real estate world kicked in with a jagged, desperate edge. She scrambled up, her heels catching on the hem of her designer gown, and turned toward the remains of the gala with a wild, searching look in her eyes. "It's a lie!" she shrieked, her voice cracking against the stunned silence of the ballroom. "She's senile. My mother is a retired clerk who lives in a rent-controlled apartment. That display was a fabrication, a hack." She looked to Julian Sterling, her eyes pleading for him to step forward, to use his family's prestige to smother the fire. But he remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the glowing projector screen where the Vance Foundation's seal sat atop a list of Sterling family liabilities. The scent of the expensive white lilies decorating the tables, once a symbol of her triumph, now felt cloying and heavy, like the air in a funeral parlor. "Julian, do something," she demanded, grabbing his arm. He flinched as if her touch burned him. He didn't look at her. Instead, he looked at his mother. Blythe Sterling stood like a statue carved from ice, her diamonds catching the light as she stared at the black-and-white evidence of her family's secret insolvency. The Sterling name, which had opened every door in the city for 3 generations, had just been revealed as a hollow shell, propped up by the very woman they had spent the evening mocking. Sloane's face was a mask of fracturing porcelain. The high, sharp color of her arrogance had drained away, leaving behind a sallow, sickly gray that made her expensive makeup look like a child's messy finger painting. Her eyes, usually narrowed with predatory calculation, were wide and bloodshot, darting frantically from the screen to the exit as if searching for a reality that hadn't just shattered. Her lower lip trembled with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch, and for the first time in her life, the poise she had cultivated as a weapon failed her completely. She looked smaller, her shimmering dress suddenly appearing oversized and gaudy against the backdrop of her total exposure. "The documents are authentic," a calm, masculine voice projected from the side of the stage. Marcus Thorne stepped into the light, a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He didn't look like a lawyer in that moment. He looked like an executioner. Beside him stood Detective Miller, whose presence acted as a silent, grim anchor to the legal reality of the situation. "I am the lead counsel for the Vance Foundation," Marcus said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room. The portfolio displayed tonight represents the absolute ownership of the Sterling Group's primary debt. As of 5 minutes ago, Eleanor Vance has initiated a full audit and a freeze on all subsidiary accounts. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The socialites who had been laughing with Sloane only an hour ago now physically recoiled, shifting their chairs away from her table. It was a visible, silent migration of power. "Julian," Blythe finally spoke, her voice thin and sharp. "Tell me this man is mistaken." Julian finally turned, but not to his mother. He looked at Sloane with a mixture of dawning horror and pure, unadulterated resentment. "The signatures on the bridge loans," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You told me they were from a private equity group you managed. You said your mother was a burden we had to hide." "I did it for us," Sloane hissed, her fingers digging into the silk of her skirt. "I secured our future." "You stole from the woman who was keeping us afloat," Julian countered, his voice rising in a rare moment of backbone. "You lied about where the capital was coming from. My God, Sloane, you were embezzling from your own mother's foundation to pay for this wedding." The face slap wasn't physical, but it was just as violent. Blythe stepped forward, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. She didn't look at Sloane, she looked through her. "Detective," she said, addressing the investigator. "If there has been financial impropriety regarding the Sterling accounts, the family will cooperate fully. We had no knowledge of Miss Vance's methods." The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. In a single sentence, the woman Sloane had spent years trying to impress had cut her loose to sink in the harbor. "You can't do this," Sloane screamed, turning on Blythe. "I'm going to be a Sterling." "No," Blythe said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than Sloane's shouting. "You are a liability, and the Sterlings do not carry liabilities." Detective Miller stepped forward then, the soft jingle of his belt the only sound in the room. "Sloane Vance, I have a warrant for the seizure of your personal and professional electronic devices. We'll also need you to come with us to discuss the discrepancies in the Vance Foundation's archival filings." Sloane looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face, a single ally. She found only the cold, judgmental stares of the elite she had so desperately wanted to lead. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. The room felt smaller, the walls of her own making closing in. She didn't see her mother standing in the shadows of the foyer, watching through the glass doors. Eleanor didn't feel the rush of victory she had expected. She only felt a profound, quiet clarity. She watched as Marcus handed the final termination papers to a shell-shocked Julian, and as the crowd began to filter out, whispering and pointing at the woman who had fallen from the heights of arrogance to the depths of ruin in a single night. Eleanor turned away before the handcuffs were produced. She had given her daughter every opportunity to choose family over status. Sloane had chosen the status, and now she would have the silence that came with losing it. As Eleanor walked toward her waiting car, the cool night air hit her face, smelling of rain and asphalt. It was a simple, honest smell. Behind her, the lights of the Sterling ballroom flickered and died, leaving the building in a darkness it hadn't known for decades. The reckoning was complete. The shadow was gone. 6 months had passed since the chandeliers dimmed for the final time at the Sterling estate. For Eleanor Vance, the time had moved with the slow, rhythmic grace of the seasons, a stark contrast to the frantic, jagged pace of her former life as a silent observer of her daughter's greed. She sat now in the glass-walled conservatory of her private residence, the air thick with the scent of damp cedar and blooming jasmine. The morning sun filtered through the leaves of a towering fiddle-leaf fig, casting long, dappled shadows across the stone floor. It was a quiet existence, one she had built with the precision of an architect and the patience of a saint. The snip of her pruning shears was the only sound in the room until the heavy oak door creaked open. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his polished Oxfords clicking softly on the slate. He didn't look like a shark today. He looked like a man delivering a final ledger. He carried a single manila folder, the edges slightly worn from transit. "The final receivership papers for the Sterling Holdings," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. He didn't need to shout to be heard in the stillness Eleanor had created. "The ballroom, the estate, the vineyard, it's all been liquidated to cover the Vance Foundation's diverted assets. Blythe Sterling has moved into a managed care facility in upstate New York. She refused to see Julian before she left." Eleanor didn't look up from the rosebush she was tending. She reached out, feeling the velvet texture of a petal that was just beginning to wilt. "And Julian, working in a mid-level logistics firm in Chicago," Marcus replied. "Under a different name, I hear. He's paying back the restitution in increments that will take him 3 lifetimes to complete. He's a ghost, Eleanor, just like he wanted everyone else to be." Eleanor finally set the shears down on the wrought iron table. The cold metal felt grounding against her palms. She took the folder from Marcus, her eyes scanning the clinical descriptions of a family's collapse. There was no joy in the reading, only a profound sense of equilibrium. The Sterlings had built their throne on her silence, and when she had finally spoken, the foundations had simply turned to dust. "And my daughter?" she asked. The word daughter felt heavy, like a stone she had been carrying in her pocket for far too long. Marcus hesitated, a rare flicker of sympathy crossing his face. "Sloane Vance is currently residing in a studio apartment in the garment district. It's located directly above a 24-hour industrial laundromat. Detective Miller sent over the final surveillance report this morning. She's working as a junior clerk for a discount property management firm. Her real estate license was permanently revoked following the fraud investigation." Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining Sloane in a space that smelled of bleach and hot exhaust instead of expensive French perfume. She pictured her daughter's manicured nails chipped from filing paperwork, her designer wardrobe replaced by off-the-rack polyester that chafed against her skin. It was a proportional justice. The woman who had mocked her mother's modest life was now struggling to maintain one of her own. "She tried to call the foundation yesterday," Marcus added quietly. "She wanted to discuss a reconciliation for the cameras. A local news outlet offered her a pittance for an interview, but they wanted you there to play the forgiving mother." "I hope you gave her the same answer I gave her 6 months ago," Eleanor said, her voice like ice. "I didn't give her an answer at all," Marcus said. "I simply hung up. Silence is the only currency she understands now." Marcus left shortly after, leaving Eleanor alone with the ghosts of her victory. She walked over to a small, antique desk in the corner of the conservatory. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of foundation reports, was a framed photograph. It was Sloane at age 7, her hair in messy pigtails, clutching a dandelion she'd picked for her mother. In that image, Sloane's eyes were bright with a genuine warmth that had long since been strangled by ambition. Eleanor traced the glass over the child's face. This was the cost of the reckoning. She had saved her legacy, she had protected the foundation, and she had dismantled the vipers who sought to consume her. But in doing so, she had finally accepted that the daughter she once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw people only as rungs on a ladder. The silence in the conservatory was no longer a refuge, it was a reminder. Eleanor had won the war, but the palace she defended was empty. She picked up the shears once more and moved to a dead branch on the hibiscus plant. With a single, sharp click, she removed the rot, clearing the way for new growth that would never know the shadow of the Sterling name. She stood there for a long time, watching the sun move across the floor, a lone queen in a garden of peace, surrounded by the beautiful, bitter fruit of her own justice.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.